Okay, so you sent us this news article about South Korea, and wow, martial law. Huh. That's not something you hear every day,
Yeah,
especially not on a country like South Korea. I mean, they have a pretty solid democratic track record, right?
it is definitely a jarring headline for sure. President Yoon Suk-yeol's decision to declare martial law. I mean, nobody saw it coming. This hasn't happened in South Korea for almost 50 years,
Yeah.
which makes you wonder what on earth could have led to such a dramatic move.
Exactly. And the article mentioned this all went down like during a late night TV broadcast. Like, can you
Yes.
imagine turning on your TV and bam, martial law?
Yeah.
So walk us through it. What happened? Like, what was the immediate reaction when this declaration dropped?
Well, it was pretty much instantaneous. Thousands of protesters just flooded the parliament building.
Wow.
And opposition lawmakers were scrambling, trying to organize an emergency vote. It was chaos. The article paints a really vivid picture. You
Right.
know, helmeted troops, helicopters landing on the parliament roof. They even had masked soldiers with guns going into the building. Staffers were even trying to, push back using fire extinguishers.
That sounds like something out of a movie.
Right. Except this was actually happening.
Yeah. So did President Yoon give any reason for, declaring martial law? Like, what was his justification?
Yeah, he did. He basically blamed it on anti-state forces
Right.
and brought up the whole North Korea threat, that's always looming.
Right.
But the article points out that he didn't actually provide any evidence to connect the opposition with North Korea.
Hmm. Interesting. So it's like he's trying to link martial law with like the survival of South Korea, but without any real proof.
Exactly. It's a pretty bold move.
Yeah, and calling out these anti-state forces, it's a pretty loaded term, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that kind of rhetoric actually worked with the South Korean public, or were people pretty skeptical?
Hard to say for sure, but considering Yoon's approval ratings were already pretty low, like around 17%.
Oh, wow.
And he's had, his fair share of scandals. I'd say there was probably a good amount of skepticism.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense.
It's worth noting that Yoon was elected as a hardliner, but his party took a major hit in the recent elections.
Yeah.
So he's kind of a lame duck president now, can't really get anything done in parliament.
Ah, so he was already in a tough spot politically even before this whole martial law thing.
Exactly. And the opposition was really turning up the pressure. They were talking about budget cuts, starting impeachment proceedings against cabinet members,
Wow.
even going after top prosecutors who were aligned with Yoon.
So it sounds like Yoon was feeling pretty cornered, with opposition from both inside the government and the public.
Yeah.
So do you think he saw martial law as a way to kind of regain control?
It's definitely a possibility. You got to remember the last time South Korea was under martial law was way back in 1979 after the assassination of Park Chung-hee, who was their long-term military dictator.
Right.
And since South Korea transitioned to a parliamentary democracy in 1987, this was the first time they ever used this measure.
So this was a pretty huge deal for South Korea then. But if they haven't used martial law since becoming a democracy, it begs the question, what does it actually mean in their context? Is it like a full-on military takeover, or is there more to it than that?
It's not a complete takeover, not in the traditional sense. I mean, martial law in South Korea is basically temporary military rule during a state of emergency.
Hmm.
It's supposed to be used when the civilian government can't function properly. It's almost like hitting pause on the regular government,
Okay, so it's not permanent. It's more about temporarily handing power over to the military during a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But that still makes me wonder, how much power does the military actually have during this pause? Could they arrest lawmakers or overrule the parliament?
That's where it gets interesting. South Korean law actually has built-in safeguards. Like, it requires the government to lift martial law if the parliament votes against it.
Huh.
And this is key. It prohibits the arrest of lawmakers while martial law is in effect.
So even in this crazy situation, the parliament still had some authority, and the lawmakers had some protection. That's a pretty important detail.
Oh, absolutely. And those safeguards ended up playing a major role in how everything played out. Remember how the opposition lawmakers immediately called for an emergency vote?
Yeah.
Well, they actually voted down the martial law declaration.
Yeah. So they were able to overrule the president's declaration, even though martial law was technically in effect.
Yep. And because of those legal safeguards, the government had to lift martial law. The whole thing only lasted about 6 hours.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing how those legal mechanisms acted as a check on the president's power.
Yeah, it's like a high-stakes game of constitutional chess.
Right.
Each side making their moves within these specific rules.
Oh.
But even though it was short-lived, I'm sure this whole thing sent shockwaves through South Korea.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine the confusion and anxiety during those 6 hours. You're just watching TV and suddenly your country is under martial law. Even though it was quickly overturned, the article mentions experts are worried about the long-term damage to South Korea's reputation as a democracy.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes you wonder how other countries are going to view this, especially since South Korea is seen as this democratic success story in the region. Could this be seen as a sign of democratic backsliding?
It's possible. Some experts have even compared it to the January 6th riots in the U.S.
Really? You think those events are comparable? I mean, the goals and the level of violence were pretty different, weren't they?
That's true. The contexts are definitely different, but there are some interesting parallels in terms of, the challenges to democratic norms and how it could erode public trust in institutions. And you have to think about the international perception. South Korea is a key U.S. ally, and this incident could raise concerns about stability in the region.
Yeah, you're right. This wasn't just some internal political squabble. It could actually affect South Korea's relationships with other countries and their standing on the world stage.
For sure. And the article quotes this expert, Leif Erik Easley from Ewha University in Seoul. He sees this whole thing as a major political miscalculation by Yoon. He thinks it might even increase calls for impeachment.
So not only did this move backfire in terms of, silencing the opposition, it might actually make Yoon even more vulnerable.
Seems that way. It's like he accidentally gave his opponents more ammunition to use against him.
So we've talked about the immediate fallout from Yoon's declaration, the legal and political back and forth and the potential long-term consequences both inside and outside South Korea. But what about the ripple effects? Could this event have a lasting impact on South Korean politics? What do you think?
That's the million-dollar question. We've seen the initial reaction, the legal maneuvering, the international concerns, but what does it all mean for the future of South Korea? That's what we need to dig into next.
Okay, let's dive into that then.
I think this whole thing really shows you how fragile democratic institutions can be, even in a country like South Korea. I mean, they have a solid history of democratic progress.
Yeah, it's a real eye-opener. And, it makes me think about something we often take for granted. The power of people. Those protesters who went to the Parliament building. They weren't scared off by the military presence at all.
No, not at all.
They wanted their voices to be heard.
Absolutely. They knew what was at stake, and they were willing to stand up for their democracy. It's a powerful reminder that you need a vigilant and engaged citizenry for any democracy to really thrive. And it wasn't just the protesters, the opposition lawmakers played a key role too.
Right, they were so quick and decisive in challenging Yoon's declaration. It's amazing how they used the existing legal framework to counter the martial law declaration.
Oh, yeah.
Those legal safeguards we talked about, the ones that require parliamentary approval for martial law and protect lawmakers from arrest, they really proved their worth.
They were absolutely crucial. This whole situation really shows how a strong legal framework can protect against authoritarianism even during a crisis. It reminds you that democracy isn't just about elections and voting. It's also about having these checks and balances in place.
I'm curious, though, about the long-term political fallout from this event. This feels like it could be a turning point in South Korean politics.
Yeah.
Do you think this could embolden the opposition to push for bigger reforms or even try to remove Yoon from office?
It's definitely possible. This has definitely damaged public trust in Yoon's leadership.
Yeah.
The opposition might use this to push for more aggressive changes. Don't forget, Yoon was already dealing with multiple corruption scandals, some even involving the First Lady.
Oh, right.
This martial law incident just makes things worse for him.
You mentioned earlier that some experts compared this to the January 6th riots in the U.S., while the events themselves are pretty different. Do you see any parallels in terms of the long-term consequences? Could this lead to more political instability in South Korea?
It's hard to say for sure, but the potential for lasting damage is definitely there. Both events in different ways represent a challenge to democratic norms.
Yeah.
And both could damage public trust in institutions. But it's worth noting that South Korea has a strong history of democratic resilience. I mean, they've weathered political storms before.
That's true.
Yeah.
And the fact that the martial law declaration was overturned so quickly shows how strong their democratic institutions are. Still, this event has revealed some vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
It raises questions about the future of South Korea's political landscape and its place on the world stage.
Exactly. It's not just an internal issue for South Korea. It could affect regional stability and international relations.
Right.
South Korea is a major U.S. ally, and this incident might make people question their reliability as a partner. And there's also the question of how this might embolden North Korea.
Oh, yeah.
They have a history of taking advantage of weakness in the South.
It's crazy to see how this one event has triggered so many potential consequences, both domestically and internationally. I wonder, though, are there any silver linings to this situation? Could this experience ultimately make South Korea's democracy stronger in the long run?
There's always a chance that this could be a catalyst for positive change. Maybe this will make people focus on strengthening democratic institutions, promoting civic engagement, addressing underlying societal tensions.
Yeah.
It could lead to a more resilient and robust democracy in the future.
It's like South Korea has been given this stark reminder of what they could lose and how important it is to protect their democratic principles.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that goes beyond South Korea's borders. This situation really highlights how fragile democracy is globally and how important it is to be vigilant and take steps to protect it.
This whole situation really makes you appreciate the complexity of global politics.
It does.
It's like this giant interconnected web where even seemingly isolated events can have huge ripple effects.
Absolutely. And it highlights the need for nuanced analysis and being willing to consider different perspectives when trying to understand these complex events.
Okay, so we've discussed the immediate fallout from Yoon's declaration of martial law, the legal and political maneuvering, and the potential long-term consequences both inside and outside South Korea. But what does all of this mean for the average person in South Korea? How might this experience change their views on their government and the future of their democracy?
That's a great question. We have to remember that events like this don't just play out on the political stage. They affect people's lives and their sense of security. It's likely that many South Koreans are feeling shaken and unsure about the future. They might question the stability of their democracy and whether their leaders are competent.
I can see why they'd feel that way. I mean, imagine the emotional roller coaster of those 6 hours.
Right.
One minute you're just relaxing at home, the next your country's under martial law. That kind of thing would definitely leave a mark.
For sure. And it's important to acknowledge the emotional and psychological impact of these events. It's not just about the political and legal stuff. It's about how real people are experiencing this.
I wonder, though, if this experience could also motivate people to get more involved in politics. Could it spark a new sense of civic duty and a desire to protect their democracy?
It's possible. Sometimes it takes a crisis to wake people up and make them passionate about political engagement. We saw that with the protesters who went out into the streets.
Right.
This experience could encourage more people to participate in the political process, whether it's through voting activism or just staying informed about current events.
It's like this incident could start a deeper conversation about what democracy means in South Korea and how to protect it.
Definitely. And that conversation needs to happen not just among politicians and experts, but in communities, families, everyday conversations. It's about building a culture of democratic values and civic responsibility.
So while the future of South Korea's political landscape is uncertain, there's hope that this experience could lead to a more engaged and resilient citizenry.
That's a hopeful thought. And it reminds us that even when things are tough, there's always a chance for growth and renewal.
This has been a really interesting and thought-provoking discussion. We've covered a lot, starting with the initial shock of the martial law declaration and moving on to the potential long-term consequences. And while there's still many unanswered questions, I think we've gained a deeper understanding of the complexities at play and the challenges facing South Korea.
I agree. And I think this deep dive has shown us how important it is to think critically, seek out different perspectives, and stay engaged with what's happening in the world.
You know, going back to what you said about South Korea's history of democratic resilience,
Yeah.
it makes me wonder, going back to what you said about South Korea's history of democratic resilience, it makes me wonder if there are any historical parallels or lessons we can learn from their past,
Yeah.
that might help us understand the current situation.
That's a really good point. South Korea's path to democracy has been pretty bumpy.
Yeah.
I mean, they've faced military coups, authoritarian rule, economic hardship, all sorts of challenges. But they've always managed to overcome these obstacles and come out stronger on the other side.
So looking back, are there any specific moments or movements in South Korea's history that you think give us valuable insights into how they might handle the current political climate?
One that comes to mind right away is the Gwangju uprising back in 1980. This was a major turning point in South Korea's journey toward democracy.
Okay.
It was a massive uprising against the authoritarian government that took over after Park Chung-hee was assassinated.
Right, the same dictator who imposed martial law
Mm.
in the years before. So this uprising happened when South Korea was still under authoritarian rule just a few years before they transitioned to democracy in 1987. What makes the Gwangju uprising so relevant to what we're talking about today?
Well, the Gwangju uprising was a brutal crackdown on pro-democracy protesters by the military. It's a really dark period in South Korea's history, but it was also a turning point. The government's response was so brutal that it caused widespread anger and really energized the pro-democracy movement. It's often seen as a catalyst for their eventual transition to democracy in 1987.
So even though it was a time of violent repression, The Gwangju Uprising ultimately made those fighting for democracy in South Korea even more determined. It shows that progress isn't always straightforward, and sometimes setbacks can lead to even greater resolve.
Exactly. And I think that spirit of resilience is still very much alive in South Korea today. The fact that the parliament so quickly overturned the martial law declaration and that it was met with so much opposition from the public really shows their commitment to democratic principles.
It's like the memory of their past struggles gives them strength and reminds them how important it is to protect the freedoms they fought so hard for.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It suggests that a country's history can have a huge impact on its political culture even decades later. And for South Korea, their collective memory of fighting for democracy seems to have created a deep dislike for authoritarianism.
That makes me think about the global implications of what we've been talking about. If South Korea, with its history of authoritarianism and struggle for democracy, can so strongly reject a move toward martial law, what message does that send to other countries facing similar challenges?
I think it sends a really powerful message of hope and resilience.
Yeah.
It shows that even in countries with difficult and complicated pasts, the desire for democracy can win out. It also highlights how important international solidarity and support are for pro-democracy movements all over the world.
We often talk about how fragile democracy is, but this situation in South Korea also shows how incredibly resilient it can be.
It does. And it reminds us that democracy isn't something you just watch from the sidelines. It needs active participation, vigilance, and a willingness to defend it against those who try to undermine it.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive, exploring all the ins and outs of the situation in South Korea. It's clear that this event has brought up a lot of questions about the future of their democracy. What are your final thoughts for our listeners as they continue to follow this story?
I would say stay informed, stay engaged, and keep the bigger picture in mind. This situation in South Korea is like a small-scale version of the challenges that democracies all over the world are facing. It reminds us that we have to be vigilant and committed to protecting democratic values and institutions, both at home and abroad.
Well said. This has been a really insightful conversation. A huge thank you to you and to our listeners for sending us this article and inspiring this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep exploring.